July 8, 1947. A press release goes out under a base commander's name. It says the army has recovered a flying disc. 24 hours later, a general in Fort Worth says it was a weather balloon. Only one of those two statements was cleared by Washington. Which one? Look at the photograph first. A general kneeling on an office floor in Fort Worth, Texas, surrounded by torn foil and broken sticks of balsa wood. He's smiling for the cameras. Behind him, another officer holds up a twisted piece of rubber like it's supposed to mean something to you. This is supposed to be the moment the Roswell case closes, July 8, 1947. The United States Army has just announced, in a press release cleared by a base commander, that it recovered a flying disc. Now, hours later, a different general is telling reporters it was nothing, just a weather balloon. Here's the question that's kept this story alive for almost 80 years. Why did it take the US military two public statements, 24 hours apart, to explain a weather balloon? And why, 3 decades later, would the intelligence officer who first handled the debris say, on the record, that what he touched wasn't anything built on this earth? That contradiction, official retraction versus a witness who never fully recanted, is the entire Roswell case in miniature. Let's take it apart. Roswell isn't just a UFO story, it's a case study in what happens when a government tells the truth badly, and what people do with the silence that follows. For 31 years, almost nobody outside a small New Mexico ranching community thought about this event at all. Then it came roaring back, not because new debris surfaced, but because an old man gave an interview. What happened in between says as much about human memory, classification culture, and the Cold War as it does about anything that fell out of the sky. 2 federal investigations, in 1994 and 1997, would eventually try to explain the case using documents that had been secret for decades. Whether you find that explanation satisfying or not, the Roswell case is one of the most heavily documented UFO stories in American history, which makes it a rare chance to actually check the myth against the paper trail. Brazel worked a sheep ranch about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, near the town of Corona, New Mexico. Sometime in mid-June of 1947, he came across a field of strange wreckage scattered across the property. Rubber strips, tin foil, a tough, resistant paper, and thin wooden sticks. According to an affidavit he later gave, he and his son found the debris scattered across roughly 200 yards of ground. Brazel didn't think much of it at first. He picked some of it up, left the rest, and went about his work. This was the summer of 1947, the summer of the flying disc craze, kicked off weeks earlier when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects near Mount Rainier, Washington. That story had been in every newspaper in the country. So when Brazel finally heard people talking about flying discs, he wondered if what he'd found on his ranch might be connected. On July 7th, he drove into town and told the sheriff, George Wilcox, what he'd found. Wilcox called the Roswell Army Airfield. Marcel was the intelligence officer at the 509th Bombardment Group, based at Roswell Army Airfield, at the time the only nuclear-capable bomb group in the world. When Wilcox's call came in, Marcel was sent out to investigate, along with 2 counterintelligence corps agents. He and Brazel drove out to the ranch together and spent time collecting as much of the material as they could carry. Marcel gave a statement to the local paper that ran the next day. It's a strange kind of understatement, considering what it started. The 509th's Intelligence Office, the story said, had come into the possession of a flying saucer. That single sentence, printed in the Roswell Daily Record, is the spark for nearly everything that followed. Here's the detail that gets lost in most retellings, though. Marcel didn't say alien, he didn't say extraterrestrial. In July 1947, flying saucer simply meant unidentified object, the same phrase Kenneth Arnold's sighting had put into every American's vocabulary weeks earlier. Whatever it turned out to be, in that moment it was a mystery, not a verdict. Cavett was one of the 2 counterintelligence corps agents who accompanied Marcel to the debris field, along with Master Sergeant Louis Rickett. His account of that day matters because it's the account that later conflicts most sharply with Marcel's. Cavett, in interviews conducted decades afterward, maintained that what he saw on the ranch was consistent with a balloon and a radar target, nothing more exotic than that. He never wavered from that position. It's worth sitting with that for a second. Two men stood in the same field, looked at the same wreckage, and arrived at permanently different conclusions about what it was. Hout was the public information officer for the 509th. On the morning of July 8th, he later said, Base Commander Colonel William Blanchard called him and told him the base had a flying saucer, or parts of one, recovered from a ranch northwest of town. Blanchard ordered Hout to write a press release and deliver it personally to the local newspapers and radio stations. Haut wrote it. It went out under Blanchard's authority, and it said, in plain terms, that the intelligence office of the 509th had gained possession of a flying disc through the cooperation of a local rancher and the sheriff's office, and that it was being sent on to higher headquarters. That release moved fast. A local reporter named John McBoyle put the story on the wire. Within hours, papers around the world were running headlines about the US military capturing a flying saucer. Higher headquarters turned out to mean Fort Worth, Texas, the office of Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force. Marcel was ordered to fly the debris there personally. Ramey moved to shut the story down almost as fast as it had started. By that evening, he was telling reporters the object recovered near Roswell was nothing but the remnant of a weather balloon and radar reflector. Nothing to be excited about, in his words. He allowed photographers into his office to take pictures of the debris laid out on the floor, foil, sticks, rubber. Standing with him for those photos were his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas Dubose, and a weather officer named Irving Newton, who identified the material as balloon equipment on site. By 10 o'clock that night, the story was effectively over. The next morning's papers ran the correction. The Roswell Daily Record's rival, the Roswell Dispatch, put it plainly. Army debunks Roswell flying disc as world simmers with excitement. And with that, the case went quiet. Not for a week, not for a year, but for 31 years. That's the part of the Roswell timeline that rarely gets its own screen time, but it should. This wasn't a case that festered in public memory, fed by decades of protest and speculation. It nearly vanished. Brazel gave one more interview in the days after the retraction, in which he said he was sorry he'd ever said anything about a disc. He just wanted the fuss to stop so he could get back to his ranch. And then, largely, silence. A man in New Mexico found some tinfoil and sticks in a sheep pasture, and it took the United States Army exactly 1 day to turn that into an international incident, and 1 more day to shut it back down. What happened in 1978 is the reason you're watching this video right now. Friedman, a nuclear physicist turned UFO researcher, tracked Marcel down in 1978 and interviewed him about what he remembered from July 1947. It was the first time in 3 decades that anyone had asked Marcel, on the record, what he thought he'd handled. Marcel's answer reopened the case. He told Friedman he believed the material he collected was not anything built by any nation on Earth, that it was, in his account, extraterrestrial. This was the same man who, in 1947, had told a local newspaper reporter about a flying saucer, using language that, at the time, meant nothing more specific than unidentified. 31 years later, he was using very different language, and he meant something very specific by it. In 1980, authors Charles Berlitz and William L. Moore published a book called The Roswell Incident, built substantially around Marcel's 1978 account. It's the book that took a regional news story from 1947 and turned it into the version of Roswell most people know today: crashed disc, cover-up, and, in later retellings that built on this foundation, recovered bodies. Roswell stopped being a one-day wire story and became a permanent fixture of American UFO culture. The city eventually opened a UFO museum. It still holds an annual festival. Everything up to this point could be told as a clean story. Cover-up in 1947, whistleblower in 1978, book in 1980, case reopened. But the record doesn't stay clean. This is the point where you have to hold 2 facts in your head at once, because neither one cancels the other out. Fact 1. Sheridan Cavitt, who stood in the same debris field as Marcel and handled the same material, never told a version of this story involving anything other than a balloon. He held that position for the rest of his life. 2 witnesses, 1 field, 2 permanently incompatible memories, held with equal conviction, decades apart. Fact 2. Walter Haut, the man who physically wrote and delivered the original flying disc press release, was not consistent either. In some interviews, decades after the fact, he said he believed the material was a craft from outer space, and he later signed a sworn affidavit describing far more dramatic claims, including alien bodies he said he'd seen. But in at least one televised interview with a Bay Area station, Holt said something very different, that he'd learned within days of writing the release that it was a screw-up, and that he believed it had probably been a balloon after all. Which Walter Holt do you believe? The record doesn't resolve that for you. Both statements came from the same man's own mouth, on camera, years apart. That inconsistency isn't a footnote, it sits at the center of the case, because Holt is arguably the single most important witness in the entire Roswell timeline. He's the one who wrote the words "flying disc" that started all of this. By the 1990s, congressional pressure and decades of public interest pushed the Air Force to formally re-examine its own record. 2 reports came out of that effort. One in 1994, one in 1997, and together they're the most detailed official accounting the case has ever received. The 1994 report identified the material recovered near Corona as wreckage from a classified program called Project Mogul, a Cold War effort to detect Soviet nuclear detonations by floating strings of balloons carrying acoustic sensors into the upper atmosphere. One of the engineers who'd actually worked on those balloon trains, Charles B. Moore, confirmed in 1994 that the descriptions and photographs of the Roswell debris were consistent with the materials Project Mogul used, including a distinctive radar reflector design built from foil laminated balsa wood, exactly the kind of tough paper and sticks Brazel had described finding on his land. If Moore and the Air Force are right, the sequence makes a strange kind of sense. A top-secret balloon train came down in a remote sheep pasture, got reported as a disc during the most UFO-obsessed summer in American history, got walked back within 24 hours because nobody wanted to explain a classified nuclear detection program to the press, and the cover-up, if you can call it that, wasn't covering up aliens, it was covering up Mogul. Lonius, the Smithsonian's former curator of space history, put it in blunter terms years later. It was, in his words, easier for the Air Force to let the public believe in a flying saucer than to explain what Project Mogul actually was. He said the flying saucer story was, in a strange way, the more convenient cover, and once that story took hold, in his phrase, we were off to the races. The 1997 Air Force report went further, trying to address a part of the Roswell legend that had grown up entirely after 1978, claims of recovered alien bodies. The report's conclusion is speculative by its own admission, but it's worth stating carefully because it's the least clean part of the entire case. The report suggested that some later witness memories of bodies may have been the product of decades of overlapping recollection, conflating things that happened at different times. It pointed to anthropomorphic crash test dummies, dropped by parachute from high-altitude balloons over New Mexico in the 1950s as part of unrelated Air Force testing, and to a real, tragic 1956 plane crash in the same region that killed and injured airmen. The theory is that witnesses, recalling events across a span of years, folded these later, unrelated incidents into their memories of 1947. To be clear about what this is and isn't, it is the Air Force's own explanatory theory, not a proven fact, and it has been criticized by researchers who point out that it asks witnesses to have badly misdated events by nearly a decade. But it is the official record's honest attempt to explain a part of the myth that Marcel, Cavett, and the original 1947 documents never mention at all. Nobody in July 1947, not Brazel, not Marcel, not Hout, not the newspapers, reported bodies. That detail entered the story decades later, through different witnesses entirely. If you strip away everything added after 1978 and ask what actually happened in July 1947, the best documented version is this. A rancher found genuinely unusual wreckage. Trained military intelligence personnel investigated it and, in the moment, described it using the era's ordinary term for anything unidentified in the sky. A base issued a hasty press release using dramatic language that a general retracted within a day, offering a mundane explanation that happened to protect a classified program. Decades later, the officer who wrote that press release and the officer who first handled the debris could not agree with each other, or in Holt's case, with himself, about what it had really been. That last part is the strongest evidence in the entire case. Not for aliens, and not against them. It's evidence that memory, once a story has been told and retold across 30 years, is not a reliable recording device. Marcel handled real wreckage. Cavett handled the same wreckage and remembered it completely differently. Both men, by every account, believed what they were saying. Charles Moore spent years trying to physically match Project Mogul's construction specifications to witness descriptions, balsa wood, tape, foil, and by his own account, they lined up. So where does that leave the case? With a piece of paper, the original July 8 press release that used the words flying disc under the authority of a base commander retracted the same day by a general standing over debris on his office floor, with two investigators who stood in the same field and never agreed on what they saw. With one witness whose story changed shape more than once, on camera in his own words. And with a classified Cold War balloon program that stayed secret for almost 50 years, long enough for an entire mythology to grow into the space where an explanation should have been. The Air Force says balloon. Jesse Marcel, until his death, said otherwise. Sheridan Cavett never wavered from balloon. Walter Haut said both things at different times about the same event. That photograph in Fort Worth, the general kneeling over torn foil, smiling for the cameras, was supposed to end the story in one sitting. It didn't. The question it left behind is still the same one Mac Brazel's neighbors were probably asking him in July 1947. What, exactly, was on that ranch? Almost 80 years and 2 federal investigations later, the paper trail has an answer. Not everyone who was there ever agreed to believe it.